In good weather or bad, we expect to travel where we want and when, but nature is not always so accommodating. We probably understand less about the weather than any other part of our environment. This invisible and mysterious force is the lifeblood of flight. It can also be the death of an aircraft. On January the 13th, 1982, Washington had its worst snowstorm for decades. Government came to a halt. The city closed down. Office workers were sent home early. Not until mid-afternoon were there signs of life at Washington National Airport. It had been closed all morning, to the frustration of thousands trying to escape to warmer climes. Now, passengers for Air Florida's flight Palm 90 to Miami were told to board. They were to be in the hands of a crew with little experience of bad weather.
I remember before we finally got on the airplane that I looked out there and I didn't see any evidence that the pilots had done a ground check of the airplane, which I could tell because there was no footprints walking around the airplane in the snow, and it never, the snow still looked undisturbed. So that bothered me a little bit. I specifically remember thinking, I want to see somebody walk around that airplane before I got on it. I never did see anybody walk around the airplane. Those guys were sitting fat, dumb, and happy in their cockpit and talking about the weather in Florida, as I recall, when I got on the airplane. The captain announced, after we had tried a couple times to back out using the tractor, he announced that the tractor was incapable of pulling us out by itself, but I do recall that he used some reverse thrust to try to back us out. In the snow and ice, I thought that was pretty abnormal. And as it turned out, it was, because it had the effect of sucking up the storm debris into the engines, and I think that, I know now from reading the accident reports that was a contributing cause to what happened to us. I didn't think we'd actually get airborne, but I could feel us lift off the runway. The shaker was going, I could hear the dishes coming out of the galley all over everywhere, and I knew we were in deep shit. When we hit the bridge, it was kind of like being rear-ended on a freeway, and I said, Jesus, I survived that. And then I realized I was still heavily in motion, and the next thing I know, and we were tumbling, it seemed like, and then we hit something that seemed like 100 times harder than that first hit, which had to be hitting the river. And I blacked out, and as I was blacking out, I just figured that was it, so my last thought was, God help me.
Oh my fucking God.
The plane had hit the 14th Street Bridge over the River Potomac, the main route into Washington from the suburbs of Virginia. Several cars had been crushed by the plane's undercarriage.
The dark in that airplane, it was absolutely pitch black. I remember it settling onto the ground or onto the bottom of the river before I could get my legs free. And I remember swimming out over the top of the seats toward the back of the airplane. I knew I was out of the airplane when the light in the water turned from absolute black to sort of gray. And the contrast between having been in a nice hot airplane about 1 minute earlier, or maybe 5 minutes earlier, whatever it was, and where I suddenly found myself was just phenomenal. I mean, the airplane was gone. Everything was gone. Maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes went by, something like that. And a bunch of rescue vehicles showed up on the Virginia side of the river. And I remember saying something, hey, everything's cool. They're here, And, must have been half a dozen vehicles or so pulled up and sat, parked right beside the river there, and everybody jumped up. And there were another 500 people standing out there looking at us, and they just kept standing there and looking at us with their lights going and their sirens going and all that. And eventually I realized they had no way to get to us. And there were 10,000 people probably standing up on that bridge, or it seemed like 10,000. And they were all looking at us, and the irony began to set in on me that, I'd survived an airplane crash and I was going to freeze to death.
I had just gotten there, and it was about 3 deep at the bar, and I'd ordered a drink, and I don't think I ever got it. And someone said there was something on television. They had a couple TVs in there that an airplane had crashed into the Potomac. And the first vision I had was a Cessna 172 or something like that had crashed in the Potomac. Didn't make much of it. And then there was a phone at the end of the bar, and there was a guy yelling. There were 4 lines lit up, and he was yelling for some people I knew. He was hollering across this crowd, and all the pagers started going off. And then we looked up, and we saw it, and someone got on the phone, and they said that a 737 had crashed in the Potomac. And so needless to say, we didn't have another drink.
"75 people died aboard Air Florida's Palm 90 that day in the heart of Washington, less than a mile from the White House. Despite all the people and all the technology, only 5 passengers could be saved from the freezing river. Flight attendant Kelly Duncan. Joe Stiley's secretary Nikki. She would be rescued later by a Park Service helicopter. Joe Stiley and Priscilla Tirado, who had left her baby and her husband behind in the plane. Priscilla Tirado is temporarily blinded by the spilled kerosene in the river. A passerby, Lenny Skuknik, can watch no more. He dives in and saves Priscilla Tirado's life.
Yeah, everybody get behind the fire. Get behind the fire truck, all right? Across there. Get across there. Run across the bridge on the other side.
Investigators of the National Transportation Safety Board, America's air crash detectives, now focused their attention on the wreckage. If anything, it served only to deepen the mystery. There seemed to be no mechanical problems, so why had the plane pitched into the river? True, weather conditions had been bad, but other aircraft had been taking off normally. Why not Palm 90? It was the eventual discovery of the cockpit voice recorder that was to provide the answer. The last seconds of this 30-minute audio tape echoed the desperation of the pilots as they realized they were not going to make it. Mike McDermott is an independent air accident investigator, a specialist in CVRs, cockpit voice recordings.
The CVR indicates the general attitude of the crew as being one of disguised concern. There's a lot of joking around, you hear a lot of laughing, but the joking seems to be as a way of coping with the difficulty of the situation, their nervousness in flying in snow, maybe due to their lack of experience. There are instances where they indicate the fact that the de-icing doesn't quite help them.
This is when it's bad here on trying to de-ice things. They give you a false feeling of security, that's all it is.
They also indicate, and when they're going through their checklist and they're planning for the actual takeoff, they're talking about what they will do, how they will take off. They will apply power, they'll let the nose wheel come off the ground, fly to 500 feet, reduce the power. And their last comment is to reduce it to a certain level depending on their level of comfort, or as they say, how scared we are.
I'll put it max about 1.55, that one still how scared we are.
So I think they were very nervous about the situation. They knew that they were heavy. They had a lot of passengers and a lot of weight on board, and the snow only added to their weight, and that caused them some concern.
But why had the plane failed to take off? By analyzing the engine noise heard on the tape, investigators discovered that the pilot had never applied full power, even when the plane was about to drop out of the sky. Unbelievable as it might seem, when the crew were running through their pre-flight checklist, for some reason they had neglected to switch on the anti-icing equipment.
And that became a very, very controversial issue when we listened to the cockpit voice recorder, and they went through the checklist and they said engine anti-ice, and they said off, but nobody wanted to believe that they said off. Why would they say off? And there was so much disagreement later on as the investigation progressed that the tape was again reviewed, I think, by the FBI lab and voice analysis, and some people just said, no, it can't be off, it's got to be on.
Did he say on or off? Was the anti-icing switched on or not? Today's sophisticated sound equipment can clear up the mystery once and for all. McDermott simply extracts the co-pilot's response from the previous item in the checklist, the word on. Alongside it he places the suspect word, which he calls onf.
And after you've listened to this for hours, literally hours on end, I think it becomes very apparent that the second word is actually off.
The definitive judgment was that the word was off. In the freezing cold, the crew had apparently forgotten to switch on the plane's anti-icing equipment, an incredible blunder. And when the captain made his unorthodox attempt to get the plane off the ramp by using reverse thrust, he had choked the engines with ice and snow. The probes that tell the pilots their engine power had frozen, giving the crew false readings, and they mistakenly believed they were taking off at full power.
The co-pilot apparently understood what was happening, and he desperately tried to tell the captain until the very last minute that it doesn't look right, and the captain simply didn't respond to it.
Now you hear that whine, that's the application of power. You hear them talking about their engine instruments, say this is cold, this is real cold. It doesn't seem right. No, that's not right. It's the same guy. Says, no, I don't think that's right. He's really concerned about this and it's not performing right. He sort of resigns himself to it and says, yeah, well, maybe it is. Okay, at this point, they've lifted the nose off the ground and they're flying. You hear the stick shaker, the da-da-da-da-da-da sound, indicating that they're not flying fast enough. They're about to stall the wing of the aircraft. And the pilot is saying, forward, forward, we only need 500 feet. And that was the sound of the impact.
The Air Florida investigation was a milestone in the use of cockpit voice recordings to solve an accident. It also underlined a message as old as flying itself.
I frankly don't know how much more you can tell people. That you have to have a clean airplane. You can't have ice on it. I know the operations are complex, traffic situations, airport traffic, clearances, weather conditions that delay airplanes. I mean, those are all facts of life. These things happen. But at the bottom line is, when you got ice on the airplane, you're probably going to die.
That message was to be brought home again dramatically 12 years later. The NTSB's most controversial case for years is in the hands of its most flamboyant investigator. Greg Fythe joined the NTSB straight from school for a few weeks' work experience. 16 years later, he's still there.
I am a professional tin kicker. I go out there hunting down the clues, and the only way to do that is to roll the wreckage over, rummage through the wreckage to see what it's going to tell us. Well, I think that's just been a perfect way to describe the people that do this work. Airplanes are made of aluminum, and we're out there kicking it. When I go out to an accident site, and all I have is 10 acres of bits and pieces of airplane, my challenge is to go out there and try and put all those pieces back together again and figure out what actually happened to bring me to this place. I mean, I like going out and using my mind to put the puzzle back together again. That's the challenge for me. I got the greatest job in the world. As bad as it is, I have the greatest job in the world.
With more planes and more accidents, the Americans have come to be regarded as the world leaders in air crash investigation. Greg Fythe is a member of the NTSB's elite GO team, on duty 24 hours a day to fly to the scene of major accidents.
Arriving at an accident site is probably the most traumatic thing anybody could ever experience. I've conditioned myself over 16 years of doing this business, but it still bothers me when I get there, only because you have a sense of an adrenaline rush. You get there, you're pumped, you're ready to go to work, but you have to step back for a moment because you're looking at death and destruction in just magnitudes that are sometimes incomprehensible. It's one of those things where once you've smelled an accident site, you never forget it. Accident sites have a distinct smell. You could put me in the woods, turn me around in circles, and if I'm downwind, I can smell my way to an accident site. It's just, there's just a distinct sense with airplane accidents. And once you've got that in your head, you never forget it. And while I wish I could forget it, I can't. And so getting out there, you take a step back, you adjust yourself to what you're about to do, and then you go forward and do it. Some of us handle it better than others. I work with people from varying backgrounds that when they get to an accident site, they can't handle it because they can't comprehend what they're seeing out there. The death, the destruction. When you look out the window of a terminal at the airport and you see a big, beautiful 747, weighs 800,000 pounds and can carry 500 people, and then you get out to an accident site and the biggest part of that airplane left is a rudder or maybe an engine, and the loss of life that's involved, it's like looking up at night, looking at the stars and wondering where it all ends. It's very hard to comprehend it sometimes.
The investigation that Fythe has been working on for the past 2 years concerns the ATR aircraft. It's a turboprop, a propeller-driven aircraft ideal for commuter flights. The ATR is built by the French firm Aerospatiale, and it's hugely successful. 468 of them fly around the world. Now Greg Fythe thinks there's a question mark over the aircraft. The story begins in the American Midwest in 1994 with a commuter flight from Indianapolis to Chicago. On board were 64 passengers and a crew of 4. Just before arrival at Chicago, the plane was put into a holding pattern. Half an hour later, American Eagle Flight 4184 suddenly nosedived into a field outside Roselawn, Indiana, killing everyone on board.
When we got out there, it was total catastrophic destruction of the airplane. There was really nothing left. There were markers, and as you looked over the field, it was a 20-acre field. All you could see was stakes that indicated people, or what was the remains of people, and airplane parts. And the magnitude, to see that, I was standing out there thinking, I don't have much of an airplane to look at. I don't have much of anything to look at. We knew that the weather was involved. We knew that it had been windy. We knew that it was raining. We had people at the scene that were giving us that information. We also found out that there were icing conditions in the area.
Ice is a particular problem for turboprops. Jet aircraft fly at high altitude, above the ice, and have heated wings. But the ATR flies low, right in the icing zone. It doesn't have sufficient engine heat to warm the wings, so it relies on what are known as boots, pneumatic leading edges on the wings, which can be inflated to crack the ice off.
Below freezing, but is still liquid form. Now the airplane flies through the cloud. This raindrop strikes that airplane. Now, depending on the size of the drop, it may instantaneously freeze, or it may be a sufficient size where it'll actually start to run a little bit. It'll trail back until it loses all of its energy and its heat, and it'll freeze.
Could this phenomenon have something to do with the accident? To find out, the NTSB carried out an unprecedented test. They deliberately flew an ATR into danger. In front of it, a supertanker directed a yellow spray of freezing raindrops back onto the ATR. A chase plane recorded what happened next.
What those icing tests showed us was that this airplane was susceptible to a phenomenon of an ice ridge that built up behind that protected surface, or that boot along the leading edge. This ridge of ice that was developed during the icing tanker test that we have photographs of, we could see exactly where it built up. It disrupted the airflow so much that it caused the aileron to move all by itself. And if the pilots weren't anticipating it, they didn't expect it, they didn't have their hands on the control yoke, this aileron would then move, causing the airplane to react. And with Roselawn, it happened so quickly. You had a 14-degree movement of the ailerons in a quarter of a second. That's a blink of an eye. Boom. And that airplane rolled 77 degrees.
Greg Five's findings have now been officially adopted by the NTSB, despite vigorous protest from the French. They've issued their own report blaming the pilots, not the plane, for the accident. But in order to keep on flying in America, Aerospatiale have been forced to redesign the ATR's wings. As passengers, most of us have managed to suspend our disbelief in flying. But at rare moments, our vulnerability is brought home to us in a horrifying way. A sudden encounter with air turbulence can leave even experienced passengers screaming, petrified, white-knuckled.
Put him on a 270 heading 124.95.
It has a somewhat more measured effect on air traffic controllers, but even so you can still see the whites of their eyes when turbulence descends upon an airport. They may have to divert flights, close runways, even close the airport.
You got anybody behind us? Who's that, 720?
Hey Dale, the last one, 327 just off of 17 left in the 3-5 complex of Jersey, Alamosa type south gate.
The north gate is closed currently, but we don't expect that to last for more than about 15 minutes.
You could just tell me what's happening.
Hello?
In a minute.
Many crashes for which pilots were blamed are now thought to have been caused by air turbulence. Only in the 1970s, after a series of appalling accidents, was the most lethal turbulence recognized and given a name, wind shear. And its most deadly form is called a microburst. A microburst is likened to a high-pressure air hose pointed at the ground. As the air hits the ground, it bounces upward and outward in every direction. "11 years ago, the full horrors of a microburst were visited upon this airport, Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas, the second biggest in the world.
August the 2nd, 1985 was a day I'll never forget. It was your typical Texas day. beautiful weather. You couldn't have asked for a more perfect day. And when we finished cleaning the trucks for that day and put them up in the stalls for the next emergency call, we're preparing our evening meal, and it's just before 6 o'clock. There's a weather warning comes on. The weatherman says we've got a severe weather cell at the north end of DFW Airport. And we're all looking at each other, knowing what we just came out of, how beautiful it was, and we're saying, this guy's got to be crazy.
For the next 30 minutes, Dallas Airport was to experience extraordinary scenes as the full fury of nature was unleashed upon it.
But I think everything is fine. A little bouncy today, but no problem. Oh, yes. Everything looks fine. Checklist is complete, and we have been cleared to land.
Charlie Phipps, a Delta Airlines training captain, flies the Dallas approach. His simulator has been programmed with exactly the same conditions that his colleagues on Delta Flight 191 encountered that day, taken from the flight recorder of the ill-fated TriStar.
A little bit more turbulence than I expected. Glide slope, we're coming up on the glide slope again. Everything is fine. Seems like we're losing some air speed. The tailwind, yes, we got a tailwind now, a strong tailwind. Oh, yes.
Before we ran into the storm, you could hear everybody on the plane laughing and cutting up and, you know, just idle chatter. But as we got into the storm more and more, the plane got quieter and quieter. And finally, there was, you know, you could hear a pin drop in the plane.
Wow, look at the tailwind. We've got a heck of a tailwind here. Oh my God. Come on, airplane. Come on. Come on, fly, baby. Come on, baby. You can make it. Come on. Come on.
Wind shear.
Come on, baby.
Wide slope.
Come on.
Spin 'em up.
Come on. Oh.
50, 40.
The plane touched down in a field, engines screaming at full power, careered across a freeway, snapping off lampposts, bounced down upon a car, killing its occupant. Then it entered the airfield, heading at full speed, not for the runway, but to one side of it, heading for 2 4-million-gallon water tanks.
The ride really got rougher, and when we hit the first water tower, nobody knew what we hit. And it was only a few seconds after that, tenths of seconds, we hit the second water tower. And that's when all the debris and the fire came back up the left side of the plane. And that's when I ducked my head. And you really didn't know what to do. I just knew I didn't want to die. I don't know how long I sat in my chair after the plane finally came to a rest and everything, but I noticed there was only 2 people left in the plane, maybe 3, besides myself. And the plane didn't have no middle section. All the middle seats were gone. And about that time, you could hear the sirens going off. The first aid was coming to us.
The rain was so hard that I couldn't see past my windshield. The rain and the wind was holding the windshield wipers back. They wouldn't even wipe the windshield. I tried to roll the window down to see. It was like somebody standing outside with a bucket of water hitting me in the face with it. It was that bad. As I approached the crash scene then and actually got to the tanks, I was not ready for what I saw. Through all my years of training, firefighters training, I really expected to see an aircraft sitting there on the ground, but there was no aircraft. It was just pieces of an aircraft. We had 4 million gallons of water pouring out of those tanks, and when I got out of the vehicle, the water was actually almost to my chin. It was that deep, and I could see the debris from this aircraft, looming out of the water. and fire and smoke and fuel burning on the water, and I could actually see bodies burning, and it was just a tremendous sight. As the clouds and the smoke are rising from this, it was a real ominous looking scene. A flight attendant comes walking out of the smoke towards us, and it's obvious that she's in shock as she's walking towards us, and when she sees us, she just stops and just stands where she's standing, and it's so wet, it's so muddy. You know, we're just sinking up in the mud out there, and as we get closer to this flight attendant, we see that her feet are turned upside down, and she's standing there in this mud. And actually, the only thing that was holding her up was her legs being stuck in the mud. Things happen in your life that, you know, any other time I would have never in my life been able to remember August the 2nd, 1985. But this was such a tremendous thing that happened in my life and the life of all our other firemen that we'll never forget that day.
The NTSB completed its report into the Dallas accident, but for once it failed to agree with its own investigator. Rudy Kapustin retired before the investigation was complete and his report was finished by others. To this day, he disagrees with its findings, that the crew were mainly to blame.
The crew, I think, you know, when you try to evaluate did the crew do the right thing and do the wrong thing, well, in retrospect, obviously they did the wrong thing because they crashed. Can't say they did the right thing, but did they act prudently based on what they knew and continuing the approach based on what they knew at the time? I would say yes.
Lightning coming out of that one. What? Lightning coming out of that one.
The members of the board criticized the pilots for flying through a thunderstorm and attempting to land. On this computerized animation, reconstructed from the plane's own flight recorders, the black column that the plane is approaching is the microburst. But the pilots had been told that there was just a little rainstorm and that other planes were landing safely.
But there's always a reluctance, particularly if someone landed just in front of you. Everybody will say, American or TWA just landed, how come you couldn't land? The passengers will do that. They don't like to be late.
Push it up. Push it way up. Way up. Way up. Way up.
The consequences of that reluctance can be heard on the plane's cockpit voice recording.
Hang on there, Coleman. Hang on. Speed rail. 586 in the position on 179. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up. Way up. Pull up. Pull up. Right turn off. Traffic a mile per hour.
Now, the air traffic centers, air route traffic control centers, have meteorologists ever since, or because of some weather-involved accidents some years ago, had meteorologists assigned. Well, I think the one at DFW Center, he wasn't there. The backup weather facility wasn't functioning. Another one that was a backup facility for that. So in reality, real-time weather was never disseminated to that flight crew. And I was gone from the board when the report was adopted, and I had serious disagreements with the report because air traffic was just pretty much left out of the cause, and that I don't think was a fair assessment of what caused that particular accident. They pretty much left it all with the crew. Based on the fact that one of the crew members said, yeah, there's lightning in it. They knew there was weather up there, and they said, yeah, there was lightning in it. Well, you don't know where that lightning was in relation, to their position. And also during the litigation, probably the first time, I don't know if it was the first time or not, but it was video animation was used to portray this flight going in, and it showed the lightning. But that's a little bit of Mickey Mouse, I mean, you can put the lightning anywhere you want to on an animation. And of course, the government got off scot-free in the litigation too. But that's what happens. I think that's how, when it gets to litigation, I think whoever tells the most convincing story, right or wrong, wins. You know, I wasn't very happy about that.
137 people died at Dallas. Since then, the American government has ordered wind shear radar to be installed at all major airports. And NASA has developed a device that can be fitted aboard a plane to give 45 seconds advance warning of wind shear, enough to allow the plane to get out of trouble. So far, only one airline, Continental, has installed it.
We have an airplane crash over here, just around Whitefield Park.
Air crash detectives are rarely stumped for a solution. Even the most tangled heap of wreckage usually gives up an answer. But recently, the NTSB has had to declare itself mystified by 2 serious accidents. What makes it worse is that both happened to the same type of plane and in an eerily similar way.
What kind is it, Mrs. Smith?
I don't know.
The first came in 1991 in the town of Colorado Springs in the foothills of the Rockies. It was witnessed by a teenager with a video camera.
Okay, they're telling us to move the area. Because, sir,
they don't want anything touched.
What kind of plane is it? Do you know?
Small private plane.
Private jet or something.
Small private plane?
But this was no small private plane. It was a Boeing 737, the most popular passenger aircraft in the world. Aboard were 25 passengers, of whom not a trace remained.
Am I getting out of my way?
I don't think that there's any survivors in there.
The Colorado Springs, the airplane had crashed into a hole virtually nose first. We had a flight data recorder with 5 parameters that didn't give us a lot of information. Cockpit voice recorder, which was audible but of not very good quality. We knew that the weather in the area at the time was very windy. We do know that it was bad. In fact, I heard sometime into the investigation that we had gotten a call from a citizen who had a group of homing pigeons that I guess they turn them loose for some kind of a competition, or they'll fly from one place to the other. And on that day, near the time of the accident, this gentleman had turned his homing pigeons loose, and they had been thrown to the ground.
There was one common thread running through all the eyewitness accounts: a mysterious wind, powerful enough to blow cars around in a junkyard, to knock buildings over in the night. Several spoke of seeing a huge rotor, a sort of horizontal tornado, rolling off the Rockies. The NTSB were unconvinced. Rotors exist, but none has ever been recorded capable of knocking over a Boeing 737.
It's very frustrating personally. I was the chief of the investigation division. The investigators in charge worked for me. That's our job, find the cause. Put a team out there and find the cause and write the report and write the recommendations. And it's a sense of failure that we couldn't do it. I know that my colleagues shared that, and I know the board shared it. We had to, in a public meeting, come in and present the evidence after 19 months and say we didn't have the cause.
And then came another. In September 1994, 3 years after Colorado Springs, U.S. Air Flight 427 into Pittsburgh crashed in almost identical circumstances. 132 people were killed outright. For the investigators of the NTSB, the alarm bells began to ring.
Since Colorado Springs, which is not a solved accident in terms of definitive cause, since that time we have been taking a look at 737s everywhere in the world that crash. Every time a 737 has an event, we've been monitoring it quite closely. So when you initially come up to something like Pittsburgh, it makes you wonder whether it's another Colorado type Springs event. Maybe we'll find here the clue that solves Colorado Springs. Maybe not. Going to the accident scene itself, how surreal and quiet it was. It had just rained. It was very early in the morning, about 7:30, and we actually got to the accident site. the wreckage was still smoldering. So you're walking through probably the most incredible devastation I've seen in fragmentation on an accident site.
You can see it's not very far from the tail section.
Bodies up there.
Yeah, the first on scene was very unreal. Just taking a look around and then trying to find out where the various pieces of the airplane were, because when we initially walked up the scene, you couldn't see anything recognizable as an airplane.
I may be wrong on that. This is a pressure switch of some sort. Yeah, pressure switch.
It's a one of the leading edge slide actuators. Rich, we got a slide actuator here.
Okay, that's a Kruger flap actuator.
Be careful, Jesus.
Should have come from the other side.
You don't think somebody's trying to get out?
As I walked into the accident scene, the day after the accident, I ran across a small backpack that had that evidently belonged to a child. And as I walked past it, I stopped and looked at it, and I started to see the backpacks that we had prepared for my kids. I have two boys, and when we used to travel, we would put together a backpack with color crayons and cookies and crackers and things to keep them busy in the airplane. As I walked through the accident scene, trying to decide what we were going to do that day, I saw the backpack, and I had to sit down because I really couldn't take another step. It really felt like someone had hit me with a board between the eyes.
Very early in the investigation, it was clear looking at the flight data recorder that 427 had encountered the wake vortices of another aircraft at the time the upset started. In looking at the radar tapes, we were able to fit that a 727 had passed through just about the same airspace but 300 feet higher at the time of the upset, and it was about 70 seconds ahead. This brought up the theory of what could the wake vortices from a 727 have caused on a 737.
Wake vortices are the streams of air turbulence coming from the tips of a plane's wings. Could an aircraft be pitched over by flying into them?
We took an FAA 727, put vortex generators on its wings. US Air provided a 737 that we instrumented with all the parameters we'd like to have for rudder pedal position, this and that, and went out and flew about 120 different wake vortex encounters at different distances to see how severe a wake vortex could be. We collected a tremendous amount of data. Some of it's quite fascinating. But one thing it did show is that the wake vortice would not cause the same yaw motion that we need to cause the upset. It's clear that the event starts at the same time as the wake vortex is encountered, but we are fairly convinced that the vortex itself did not cause the loss of control of the aircraft.
A second crash with no obvious solution, unprecedented in the history of the NTSB. In both cases, the planes were on approach to an airport, turning onto the glide path, when they suddenly rolled over and dived into the ground. In both cases, there were unusual circumstances: air turbulence at Colorado Springs, the wake of a passing aircraft at Pittsburgh. But neither of these, whilst they may have provided the initial upset, were sufficient in themselves to tip the plane over. Everything was consistent with the rudder suddenly being pulled hard over, something a pilot would be extremely unlikely to do. Could the rudder have moved of its own accord?
One thing that we have learned from Pittsburgh is that the best match as to the cause of the accident is the deflection of the rudder. What may have caused the rudder to deflect remains the question in this investigation.
In a hangar, the U.S. airplane was carefully reconstructed. For the past 2 years, exhaustive tests have been carried out on the rudder. They're looking for a microscopic particle that could cause it suddenly to jam. They think they're onto something, but until they're sure, a question mark hangs over the world's most popular plane. Could it happen all over again?
There's a question in the public's mind about the safety of the 737. I receive calls and letters every now and then from somebody who has to fly on a 737 and ask me what they think of the airplane. The 737, there's over 64 million flight hours. There's something like 26,000 aircraft flying about. They're encountering different conditions all over the world every day. I'm told that a 737 takes off every 3 minutes somewhere in the world. Therefore, what we're looking for is not just unusual, it verges on being bizarre. We're looking for an event that has happened extremely rarely in the life of the aircraft. An event where the crew could not control the airplane, an event that they were unprepared for. Something that happened that is just beyond normal operation. Therefore, we're looking for this bizarre little element that can only happen once every, billion hours or something like that, a flight time, and it makes them more difficult. We're down looking at infinitesimal particles and what they may be doing. It makes it a very difficult and also in-depth investigation.
Do you have a hunch?
I have a hunch, but I'll keep that to myself.
That hunch led to a startling discovery. A tiny servo valve in the rudder could stick if the pilot moved the rudder quickly. If that happened, the plane would steer in exactly the opposite direction to the one intended. It was as if a car driver turned the wheel left and the car turned right instead. Only releasing the rudder would stop it, but the pilot, unknowing, would press harder and harder, trying to force the plane to turn in the right direction. Disaster was inevitable. The valves are now being replaced. Aircraft cannot tame the power of the wind any more than ships can control the tides. Scientists still know little about the violent movements of the atmosphere, what causes storms to grow or die. No aircraft can resist the worst that the weather has to offer. Last year, it was a major factor in 1/3 of all air disasters. But thanks to air crash investigators, we now have a much better understanding of its dangers, how to detect them, and how to avoid them.